Hi guys, today's video is going to be a little bit of a strange one. I had a viewer request a while back now for how you can go about painting pack animals, so like donkeys and mules and stuff like that. And at first it kind of struck me as an odd request because, you know, it's definitely, you know, not the first thing you maybe think of when you consider, you know, wargaming armies, but after more consideration, I realized it's actually something that's really useful for a lot of people playing a wide range of periods and with a wide range of different forces, because, you know, pack animals were used for everybody kind of throughout history. So when I was at Crisis 2 weeks ago, I went over to the Foundry stand. They have several sets of pack animals, which are kind of a mix of horses, donkeys, and mules, all different sizes, all different types, and carrying a variety of different bits of equipment that would work for all sort of different time periods. So this is the one model I chose to paint here. I think it is a small mule, especially since it's not super fuzzy or anything like a donkey. So that's how I'm going to be painting it. Apparently, Foundry says that these packs are actually some of the oldest in the entire range. So, if you pardon the pun, these have literally been around for donkey's years. So, I hope you'll find this to be a very useful practical tutorial, and with any luck, a bit of fun as well. Okay, so as always, I'm starting out here with all the colors you're going to need for this model. I tried to limit the palette as best as I could, but there's still a fair number of paints here, and that's really just because when you've got a pack animal with a lot of baggage, you're going to need a fair number of different colors just to get a sort of a nice, diverse, interesting looking model. Okay, first up, I want to start out by saying that when you're doing this, you're really going to want to do a little bit of research. Mules, particularly, if you're painting those, are a cross between a donkey and a horse, obviously, and while donkeys tend to be more uniform in appearance, horses obviously vary greatly, and when you cross the two of them, you're going to get an animal that varies not only a lot in size, but also in coat. So you'll have some that look sort of more like horses and have more horse coloration. Then you have some that are going to be more sort of donkey looking with donkey coloration and size. So, you know, there's a lot of variation, and you can do a lot of different things here. I decided to go for a fairly classic looking coat pattern, and I'm going to use one here that's sort of more on the donkey side of things, mainly because this is sort of a smaller animal, so I feel like it's probably got more donkey in it. And I also think that this donkey, so this traditional sort of donkey coat pattern and coloration will be sort of more widely useful to you, especially since I've done a lot of tutorials on painting horse coats already. So the base coat I'm using here is going to be a mixture of the dark gray and the burnt umber. So I'm going for sort of this nice sort of very warm brown gray shade. So if you're going for the sort of more classic donkey markings, now you're going to have to be adding some sort of very light gray tones to other parts of the coat. Traditionally, you're going to kind of see a light white gray color on the legs and the belly of the animal, and also sort of inside the ears, on the muzzle, and sort of as rings around the eyes. So what I've done here is I've taken some Vallejo Deck Tan and I've darkened it a bit with that other base shade that I made earlier so that everything really fits together. And you can see I'm going to start here by roughing out where I want those sort of lighter bits of the coat to be on the animal. And once I've got that sort of figured out, I'm then going to start working on blending those lighter areas with the darker areas where that happens. One nice thing about this particular model is because of where all the baggage is, it kind of obscures a lot of that, but you're still going to do it a little bit, and, you know, depending on the model, you might have to do it more. So once I've got a nice, really solid coat, I find the easiest way to blend these two things together is with wet blending. So what I'm doing there is I'm taking either the lighter shade or the darker shade. It doesn't matter too much which you apply first, and you're going to apply that sort of along the edge or the sort of the dividing area between those two colors, and then you're immediately going to go and grab the other color and apply that on top while the first color is still wet, and you're really going to try to mix them together on the model. This is not something I normally advocate, but especially since this is really early on in the painting process, and this is really sort of the base for everything else. I think it makes a lot of sense here, and we don't have other sort of highlights or shades that we've applied yet that are going to maybe get obscured or messed up by the wet blending process. So you can see here, I'm just kind of working those two colors together. I'm spending a lot of time, particularly on the sort of the leg and torso transition areas, and also on the muzzle. The insides of the ears and the eyes, I'm going to leave that definition a little bit sharper, because on a mule or donkey's coat, those areas do tend to be a little bit better defined. So once I've got all the light and dark areas of the coat where I want them, and I've got them blended together, I'm just going to start highlighting. I'm going to start highlighting first on the light areas of the coat. This is arbitrary. You could do the dark areas first. It doesn't really matter, whatever you feel comfortable with. My first highlight here is really just taking some deck tan and just lightening that base color that I had already, and just sort of, just like you would when you were sort of normally shading an animal skin or coat, just sort of start building up the lighter tones on the sort of more bulging areas of the musculature and so forth. I'm just going to keep adding more and more highlight layers, just basically mixing in more and more of the deck tan and lightening it up further and further until I get all the way up to pretty much pure deck tan. And then I'm going to add one final really high highlight on top of that by adding some white to the deck tan. And the color you're going to get at that point is going to be a pretty transparent one, so you can actually build up quite a few layers of color, and it won't really necessarily hit its full intensity. And because I don't really want this animal to be too bright or too highly highlighted, I'm not necessarily going to push all of these kind of highlight layers to their sort of limit in terms of how saturated they can get. I'm going to purposely leave it a little bit more subtle, a little bit more muddy, and so I mean, but this of course is to taste, so you can kind of decide if you want your donkey's light markings to be brighter white, then obviously apply more layers of paint and just build it up more so that you get sort of a brighter finished look. Once I'm happy with the white highlight areas, I'm going to now take some Citadel Null and Oil Wash, and I'm going to apply that to the dark gray regions of the donkey, just to get a little bit more contrast there, because I decided the base coat was maybe not quite dark enough, and it also really helps with some of the shadow areas and the mane and tail and stuff like that. Just be really careful here that you don't get your wash onto the white areas that you've already highlighted. Next, I'm going to highlight the darker tones on the donkey's skin. To do this, I'm taking my base color, which was the dark gray, again mixed with the burnt umber, and I'm going to sort of start lightening it using my deck tan again. And I'm using the deck tan because having this sort of color that I'm using throughout everything really is going to help kind of unify the model. So yeah, my first layer, I'm not going to add too much deck tan, and then I'm going to sort of add progressive layers where I build up more and more. And you're really going to have to decide for yourself just how light you want to let the coat get. My recommendation would not be to go too far with this, because you may end up then with the dark part of the donkey's coat looking too close to the light part of the donkey's coat, and you probably don't want that. So a little subtlety is called for here. If you think you're going to want to highlight higher, then I recommend that you start with a darker base here than I did, and then you can kind of push it further. But you can really do this to taste. You can decide whether you want sort of a more darker, sort of very almost black, dark gray donkey, if you want a more sort of light gray, sort of dirty looking donkey, which I just thought was kind of nice here, so that's kind of what I went for. Next, I'm going to grab some black paint and take care of a few detail areas, which include the donkey's hooves, his mane and tail, which I'm base coating in black, and also his eyeballs and sort of the insides of his nostrils. So I'm just going to use some nice thin black paint and sort of carefully paint in all those areas. Once that's done, I'm going to use some of my dark gray to carefully apply highlights to the areas I just painted, like on the hooves to get a little bit of a shininess, and also just to carefully, slightly highlight the mane and tail hair. I wouldn't put too many layers here, and I would keep them fairly subtle and dark. I did 2 layers, one with just pure dark gray and then where I lighten it very slightly to get a little bit of extra shine. When you're done, especially with the mane and tail, I recommend you also go back in with a Null Oil wash and reapply it on those fur areas. That'll help unify everything and add more sort of contrast down in the recesses. The final other thing you're going to want to do is the detail with those eyeballs. You want to leave them mostly black, but you want to grab just a dot of white paint and put that in both, just to add a little bit more sort of life and reflection to the whole model. Now I'm going to be taking care of the sort of tack and leather straps and stuff that are on the donkey. I'm going to be using a fairly standard leather formula here, so I'm starting out, as always, with a base coat of Vallejo German Camouflage Black-Brown. In order to highlight my leather straps, I'm first going to go in with a coat of the burnt umber that I already got out. I'm going to apply that over top. I'm going to keep it kind of thin on this first coat, just so there's some transparency and you can see a bit of that dark base coat through it in places. Again, you probably want to focus the light color towards the sort of the top surface of your bridle and then sort of pull it down so you get a little bit of a darker look towards the bottom. Once the burnt umber's on, I'm going to grab some German Camouflage pale brown, and I'm going to mix that about 50-50 into my burnt umber, and I'm going to apply another slightly brighter highlight layer on the leather, and keep it again really thin, kind of blend it out, because you really want to keep some dark areas on the leather. You want that kind of tonal variation. That's what makes the leather look good. And I'm going to then finally finish off with just pure German Camouflage pale brown, and I'm going to apply that sort of as a very thin edge highlight, sort of again along the sort of the top surface of all these leather straps, so it looks like you've got that extra highlight and just at a place where there's a little bit of extra wear and extra bit of sort of shine on the surface. This donkey is carrying some wooden barrels, so I'm going to be working on those next. You can do wood in a whole bunch of different ways, but I really wanted these to have sort of a worn, weathered appearance to them, and the best way to get that with wood is to work some gray into your brown. So I took a base here that's mostly burnt umber, but again, I took and worked some of that dark gray into it, so you can see it kind of has a very sort of muddy, cool look to it. I then went over the whole surface with a really heavy wash of Citadel Agrex Earthshade. Okay, so this is super embarrassing, but I realized that I somehow managed not to film how to highlight the barrels, so I'm going to talk about that really quickly here. All I really did was I took that sort of burnt umber dark gray base that I already had, and then I just went ahead and took deck tan and started sort of progressively lightening it so that I could get kind of this sort of very kind of faded grayish looking light brown color, and I really just started applying that especially along the edges of all the barrel staves and bits of the wood, and sort of just building that up higher and higher. And I really finished then off with an almost pure deck tan sort of edge highlight, which I ran just along sort of the sharpest edges to really emphasize the look of the barrel. When I was done, I also went back in with some Agrex Earthshade wash and kind of applied it, especially back down in the shadows, just to help tie everything back together again, and tone down some areas that I felt like I maybe highlighted a little bit strongly. So, okay, back to the usual programming now. The next thing really you've got to do on this model is to paint all of the different sort of sacks and bags and stuff that the donkey's carrying. And I personally think what you want to do here is try to use as many different kind of colors and as much variation as you can, because it's just going to make a more interesting looking model. So I'm going to show you a lot of sort of different possible color combinations you can work with. But if you're looking to save time, maybe you want to paint a lot of the bags in the same color, because that'll make things go a lot faster. I'm doing a couple bags right now using khaki sort of as the base coat to start out with. And to highlight these areas, I'm going to be taking that khaki base and I'm going to be adding in sort of more and more of my deck tan color. Again, we already had it out. Using it here will help unify all the colors in the model, so that's why I'm going for that. So I'm going to be working with fairly subtle gradations here on this area. So that, you know, because they are fairly big bags and sort of that bed roll or cloth roll there, so I don't want to go too quickly with my highlights. So yeah, I'm just going to keep adding in the deck tan and sort of building it up until I get all the way up to just almost pure deck tan, and then I'm going to add one final super high highlight on top of everything, just by mixing a little bit of white into the deck tan. And you just really want to be careful here, take your time, and that should give you a nice result. The next several bags I'm going to be painting are still going to be using colors that I already had out for other things, but this time I'm going to be going for sort of a more gray, cool tone look. So I'm base coating these with the dark gray, which I have lightened up here a bit using some of the silver gray. The highlighting process here is pretty simple. I'm just going to take more and more of the silver gray and basically just mix it into my base and just keep lightening it up and applying more and more layers. I'm going to be doing it kind of thin here, but it is really light gray tone here that I'm working with, so that means you can kind of are probably going to want to build up quite a few layers on here, especially since I don't really want these bags to look really deep gray. I want them to be kind of more of a dirty unbleached wool color. So I'm just going to keep applying layers here, as you can see, and I'm going to finish off with a sort of a final high highlight, which is going to be a mixture of the silver gray with just a little bit of white in it as well, to get a really bright highlight in some of the really sort of edges of the sack mouth and some of the more kind of sharp creases where the rope is tied around it. For the really big bundle on the mule's back, I decided to actually introduce some color, since up until now I've really been working kind of with browns and kind of neutral tones and grays. But I still wanted it to be something that was more on the sort of subdued side of things. So I took some of my dark gray and I grabbed some Oxford blue. Again, this is Vallejo, and I mixed that in to create a base. So the base color here is mostly gray with just a hint of blue. And then I started highlighting with the Oxford blue first, so that we get kind of a nice gray blue tone. And then I continued highlighting that sort of bundle by just taking my silver gray and using that to lighten up the Oxford blue, and just kind of applying several layers of that to taste. You can go for a darker blue tone or a lighter blue tone, or whatever you prefer. And if you're not into blue, you could do something similar with a lot of other colors, like green, for example. I mean, obviously, you could go for something a little bit brighter, but I think with something like this, we've got a pack animal, a lot of just sort of parcels and bundles and stuff, you wouldn't really expect them to be covered with very richly patterned or colored fabrics. So that's why I like to stick with things that are sort of more on the neutral, kind of muted side of things as far as the colors go. Now, obviously, up until now, I've been painting most of the bed rolls and bags and sacks using gray tones, using the same sort of deck tan and silver gray and dark gray and different combinations to paint everything. And so you get kind of a very unified, cool looking kind of palette. But I wanted to show you Something else you can do with warmer colors, you know, if you want to. And also just to add a little bit of variation and sort of a splash of sort of warmth and brightness to the overall look of this model. So this time I took this grain sack and I base coated it with khaki, which I already had out. But I then went ahead and got some beige out, and I used that to lighten the khaki. And you can see, as opposed to the bedroll down there, which also, you know, had quite a bit of khaki in it, what a difference it makes when you really take the same color and then just lighten it, or use just a different tone in there, because the beige is a lot warmer, so you can really see the difference that makes. So I'm basically adding sort of more and more beige into my khaki mix, and I'm just applying layers on there. Now I am not going to take it all the way up to just pure beige by itself, because I find that that's a little bit too yellow. So after I applied several layers this way, I then just lightened the color further with white instead, because that will make it get lighter but not make it get more yellow, which is not, you know, what you want at a certain point, assuming you want to kind of maintain something a little bit more muted, which is, of course, kind of, as I said in the earlier step, I think more appropriate for a model like this. Now, just because this model is mostly painted in sort of muted dull tones doesn't mean that you can't have a little fun or try to work in a pop of color somewhere. As a matter of fact, I'd recommend you do it, because it just provides a focal point. So he's got that patch on that sack, and I decided to do it in a more interesting color. So I painted it with a gray base, and then I highlighted it up using pure bright blue. And then after that, I just took some of my beige and white and painted a nice little fun checker pattern on it. Now there's various kind of pieces of rope all over this model that are kind of both being used to tie some of the bags closed and hold some of the packages in place. And also there's even sort of an actual coil of rope hanging down on one side under those barrels. So I'm base coating those areas now by taking some burnt umber, which I have lightened a bit with the German camouflage pale brown again. And that's just basically going to serve as sort of a light brown, kind of a medium brown base, I should say, for the rope areas. Now to highlight the rope areas, the first thing I did was just go over everything with a pure layer of the German camouflage pale brown. I should point out, by the way, real quick, that I am using a number 0 brush for the rope, whereas I used the number 1 brush for most of the work on the mule up until this point. With the rope being just so fine and delicate, I found it was just a lot easier to grab something a little smaller, so that's why I'm doing that. Once I had the pure camouflage pale brown on the rope, I then went ahead and got some of the beige, and I started using that to lighten up my color. Now, why did I use the beige to lighten? Well, just to get a different tone in there, but also, you know, I thought that the rope, sort of that natural fiber rope, it should have a slight yellowish cast to it. I mean, I don't want really to look yellow. I mean, you sometimes see kind of yellow looking rope, but I found it a bit cartoonish, so, you know, I didn't want to do that. But just using a little bit of yellow in there as your sort of lightening color will kind of give a sort of a nice warm look to the rope, and it'll just, you know, I just think it's a good palette for this. So I'm just going to keep working in some of the beige, make a couple layers on there, and just, you know, very carefully highlight along those thin lines. When you're just about done, if you want to add sort of a finishing touch on the rope, you can take and mix a little bit of white in an end to get a really light color, and then with your very fine brush just kind of indicate some sort of strands or fibers in the rope. They're actually kind of sculpted in there, so at least in that coil, for example, so it's not very hard to do. When I finished, I actually also went back in with some Agrex Earthshade wash, and on that coil in particular, I applied that just because I felt like the rope had gotten very, very light, particularly on the top, and it was a little more than I wanted. So by applying that wash, I kind of pulled everything back together and also brought out some detail that had gotten covered up. I didn't find that was necessary to do on the other areas of rope. I just kind of left them as they were, but I thought it was really helpful on that coiled piece. Now the mule is also carrying kind of a bundle of stakes or sticks. One of them seems to also be like an adze or an axe because it's got a metal head sticking out there. So this is another wood area, but I definitely wanted to look different than those barrels. I didn't want it to have that sort of weathered look so much. So I just started out though, the same by applying a base coat of the burnt umber. I did a different highlight though. I took some Vallejo Saddle Brown and I mixed it into the burnt umber, and I applied that as a first highlight layer, just using again my fine brush and running along sort of those poles. And then I continued highlighting first with pure Saddle Brown, and then I finally mixed a little bit of the deck tan into my Saddle Brown just to make sort of a final kind of shiny highlight, and I applied that sort of very thinly and lightly, just a very thin stripe sort of along the very top edge of those stakes, just to make it look like there was an extra reflection on the wood and just sort of a little bit of extra brightness. The mule's almost done at this point. The only real detail left to do is sort of that little axe head and also some of the metal bits on his bridle. I just did these really quickly by grabbing some Vallejo Black and then mixing in a little bit of Vallejo Air gunmetal for a base, and then just taking pure gunmetal and applying that over top as a highlight color just to brighten it up. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that in this case, because these really are very small, simple areas that you also probably don't want to get really bright and shiny. I mean, to be fair, you could have chosen, for example, to paint his the rings on his harness using a brass or bronze combo as well, but I just opted to keep everything steel here, mostly just for simplicity and so that I wouldn't have to get out more paints kind of to add into the palette. So here is the finished pack mule figure all painted up. This is a nice generic animal that would work in a whole bunch of different armies. He's not carrying anything that's really super specific to one time period. There actually are some in these Foundry packs that are much more like aimed at a specific army or historical period. But, you know, I think the techniques that I applied here should be useful to everybody, no matter sort of what army you're playing with. I tried to go for the most sort of traditional, stereotypical donkey, mule sort of coat pattern here, which I think is hopefully the most useful, because there's plenty of tutorials out there in painting horses, and if you want a more horse-like or horsey looking mule, then you just need to refer to those when you're painting the animal itself. And I've also tried, I think, to give you a good selection of different ways you can paint sort of sacks and bags and fabric, things that you can try. I mean, this is only a small sampling. You can use all kinds of different color combinations and palettes to get a neat result, and you probably yourself maybe want to limit the number of different colors you use in the baggage. I use lots and lots of different ones just to give you a big range of things to try, but if you want to save time, obviously you can definitely paint more of the bags in the same color, and that'll just make everything go faster. But whatever you do, I do recommend for a model like this you stick with sort of more muted sort of gray and kind of cream colors, and don't go crazy with bright colors or patterns, because I don't think it's very likely on a figure like this. So if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you did, please leave me comments with what you thought, leave a like or share this video with friends, and of course don't forget to subscribe as well if you haven't gotten a chance to do so already. So that's all for now, and I will see you next time.